Welcome to another episode of Ripple Stories, where fairy tales are reimagined with representation. Briar Rose, a Grimm's fairy tale reimagined. A queen once upon a time reigned in a country far, far away, where there were, in those days, fairies. Now this queen had plenty of money, and plenty of fine clothes to wear, and plenty of good things to eat and drink, and a coach to ride out in every day. But though she had been trying for many years, she had no children, and this grieved her very much indeed. One day, as the queen was walking by the side of the river, at the bottom of the garden, she saw a poor little fish that had thrown itself out of the water and lay gasping and nearly dead on the bank. Then the queen took pity on the little fish and threw it back again into the river. And before it swam away, it lifted its head out of the water and said, "I know what your wish is, and it shall be fulfilled. In return for your kindness to me, you will soon have a daughter." What the little fish had foretold soon came to pass, and the queen had a little girl, so very beautiful that she could not cease looking on it for joy, and said she would hold a great feast, and make merry, and show the child to all the land. So she asked her kinspeople, and nobles, and friends, and neighbors. But then the queen said, "I will have the fairies also, that they might be kind and good to my little daughter." Now there were 13 fairies in the kingdom, but as the queen had only 12 golden dishes for them to eat out of, she was forced to not invite one of the fairies, and did not send her an invitation. So 12 fairies came, each dressed in a color of the rainbow. The first had a red cap on her head, and red shoes with heels on her feet, and a long red wand in her hand. The second had a peach-colored cape and a wooden wand, while the third wore a sunny yellow dress and a crown of gold. After the feast was over, they gathered round in a ring, and gave all their best gifts to the little princess. One gave her intelligence, one goodness, another strength, one courage, another beauty, another riches, and so on till she had all that was helpful to be a strong woman in the world. Just as 11 of them had finished blessing her, a great noise was heard in the courtyard, and word was brought that the 13th fairy was come, with a black feather crown on her head, and black boots, and a wand made from the antlers of a stag in her hand. And presently up she came into the dining hall. Now, as she had not been asked to the feast, she was very angry, and scolded the queen very much, and set to work to take her revenge. She cried out, "The queen's daughter shall, in her 15th year, be wounded by a spindle, and fall down dead." After her dreadful wish, the 13th fairy stormed out of the hall. Then the 12th of the friendly fairies, who had not yet given her gift, came forward, and said that the evil wish must be fulfilled, but that she could soften its mischief. So her gift was that the queen's daughter, when the spindle wounded her, should not really die, but should only fall asleep for 100 years. However, the queen hoped still to save her dear child altogether from the threatened evil. So she ordered that all the spindles in the kingdom should be bought up and burnt. All the gifts of the first 11 fairies were in the meantime fulfilled, for the princess was so thoughtful, helpful, courageous, curious, and beautiful, and wise, that everyone who knew her loved her. She was tall, with curly red hair that hung down her back, and had 1,000 freckles dancing across her always smiling and happy face. It happened that, on the very day she was 15 years old, the queen was not at home, and the princess was left alone in the palace. So she roved about by herself and looked at all the rooms and chambers, till at last she came to an old tower, to which there was a narrow staircase, ending with a little door. In the door there was a golden key, and when she turned it, the door sprang open. And there sat an old lady spinning away very busily. "Why, how now, good mother?" said the princess. "What are you doing there?" "Spinning," said the old lady, and nodded her head, humming a tune, while buzz went the wheel. "How prettily that little thing turns round," said the princess, and took the spindle and began to try and spin herself. But scarcely had she touched it before the fairy's prophecy was fulfilled. The spindle wounded her, and she fell down lifeless on the ground. However, she was not dead, but had only fallen into a deep sleep. And the queen, who had just come home, and all the court fell asleep too, and the horses slept in the stables, and the dogs in the courtyard, the pigeons in the rafters, and the very flies slept upon the walls. Even the fire on the hearth left off blazing and went to sleep. The jack stopped, and the spit that was turning about with a goose upon it for the queen's dinner stood still. And the cook was at that moment scolding the kitchen boy for something he had done amiss. Let him go. And both fell asleep. The butler, who was slyly tasting the ale, fell asleep with the jug at his lips. And thus everything stood still and slept soundly. A large hedge of thorns soon grew round the palace, and every year it became higher and thicker, till at last the old palace was surrounded and hidden, so that not even the roof or the chimneys could be seen. But there went a report through all the land of the enchanted sleeping Briar Rose, for so the queen's daughter was called. So that, from time to time, several princes and even a princess came and tried to break through the thicket into the palace. This, however, none of them could ever do, for the thorns and bushes laid hold of them, as it were with hands, and there they stuck fast and died. After many, many years there came a prince into that land, who had dark skin, warm brown eyes, and a golden crown upon his brow. His name was Ozymandias, and he rode proudly on his beautiful black horse. And an old man told him the story of the thicket of thorns, and how a beautiful palace stood behind it, and how a wonderful princess called Briar Rose lay in it asleep with all her court. He told, too, how he had heard from his grandfather that many, many princes and even a princess had come and had tried to break through the thicket, but that they had all stuck fast in it and died. Then the young prince said, "All this shall not frighten me. I will go and see this Briar Rose." The old man tried to hinder him, but he was bent upon going. Now that very day the 100 years were ended, and as the prince came to the thicket he saw nothing but beautiful flowering roses, through which he went with ease, and they shut in after him as thick as ever. Then he came at last to the palace, and there in the court lay the dogs asleep, and the horses were standing in the stables, and on the roof sat the pigeons fast asleep, with their heads under their wings. And when he came into the palace, the flies were sleeping on the walls, the spit was standing still, the butler had the jug of ale at his lips, going to drink a draught. The maid sat with a fowl in her lap, ready to be plucked. And the cook in the kitchen was stuck glaring at the kitchen boy, as if she was going to give him a talking to. Then the prince went on still farther, and all was so still that he could hear every breath he drew, till at last he came to the old tower, and opened the door of the little room in which Briar Rose was. And there she lay, fast asleep on a couch by the window. She looked so peaceful that he could not take his eyes off her. He approached her quietly and took her hand in his. He wished that she would wake up so that he could greet her, and so that the enchantment that made the castle so silent would be over. He leaned his head down next to hers, still holding her hand, and fervently asked for the curse to be lifted from the sleeping Briar Rose. Just at that moment, her hand moved, and she opened her eyes and awoke, and smiled upon him, dimples forming on her rosy cheeks. Her green eyes sparkled as she looked at the prince who had helped her wake up. They went down the stairs together, and soon the queen also awoke, and all the court, and gazed on each other with great wonder. And the horses shook themselves, and the dogs jumped up and barked. The pigeons took their heads from under their wings, and looked about and flew through the windows and into the fields. The flies on the walls buzzed again. The fire in the kitchen blazed up. Round went the jack, and round went the spit, with the goose for the queen's dinner upon it. The butler finished his draught of ale. The maid went on plucking the fowl, and the cook gave the boy a scolding. And then the prince and Briar Rose spent time together, riding on hunts, reading late into the night by the hearth fire, walking in the gardens, until one day, many years later, when they were both adults, the princess asked the prince if he would be her husband. Then the wedding feast was celebrated, and there was dancing and music and much merrymaking, and they lived happily together all the rest of their lives. Snip, snap, snout, now my tale's told out. Join me next week for another tale of wonder and magic reimagined. All stories told by Ripple Stories are retold from copyright-free and public domain books.